Alright, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're standing right on the precipice of history's darkest abyss. We're about to examine a conflict of such unimaginable scale, such raw ferocity, that it literally altered the course of human events forever. I really need you to brace yourselves for a deeply serious, highly authoritative journey into the shattered ruins of 1942. But to truly help you grasp the textured, gritty reality of this historical nightmare, we're trying a completely unique visual experiment today. Every single thing you are about to see, every strategic map, every data chart, every bleak, devastated landscape, has been constructed entirely out of intricate elbow macaroni noodle art. I ask that you treat these poster renderings with the absolute deadly serious respect this heavy subject demands.
Okay, let's dive into this. 2 million. I want you to just sit with that number for a second. That's the estimated number of total casualties suffered between August 23, 1942 and February 2, 1943. 2 million human beings killed, wounded, missing, or captured in one single unyielding clash. It's a number so massive it's hard to even picture, and it immediately establishes Stalingrad as the single bloodiest battle in all of human history.
Section 1. The Setup. Operation Blue.
So to understand how two massive empires managed to concentrate so much destruction into one specific place, we really have to look at Hitler's 1942 summer offensive. This wasn't just some random clash out on the steppe, you know. It was driven by three very distinct, very crucial motives. First, the economics. Nazi Germany desperately needed to capture the Caucasus oil fields, specifically Baku. At the time, Baku was supplying over 80% of all Soviet crude oil, and the German war machine absolutely needed that fuel to keep running. Second, capturing this major industrial hub right on the Volga River would completely sever a vital transport artery for Allied Lend-Lease supplies that were coming up through Iran. And finally, the ideological symbolism. The city literally bore the name of Joseph Stalin. For both of these dictator regimes, the propaganda value is absolute. Backing down simply wasn't an option, politically or psychologically for either side.
By the late summer of 1942, as you can see rendered here, General Friedrich Paulus's elite German Sixth Army had pushed relentlessly eastward, finally bleeding their way right to the banks of the Volga River. And by doing that, they effectively cut off that vital river traffic we just talked about, choking out those crucial Allied Lend-Lease supplies. The Soviet defenders were pushed to the absolute brink, literally, with their backs against the water, seemingly facing total, imminent annihilation.
Section 2. The Struggle. Rattenkrieg.
But the city didn't fall. The German Luftwaffe relentlessly bombed Stalingrad from above, reducing almost the entire city to just jagged rubble. And in that claustrophobic, shattered environment, a new, utterly terrifying kind of warfare was born. The Germans actually came to call this the Rattenkrieg, or Rat War. All the pristine battlefields of traditional military strategy just vanished, completely replaced by brutal, room-to-room, factory-to-factory urban combat. The fighting just devolved into this nightmare of close-quarters slaughter over shattered landmarks. Some of the absolute bloodiest struggles raged through the ruins of the Red October factory, the Barikady Ordnance Factory, and all the way up the slopes of the hilltop known as Mamayev Kurgan.
To actually survive this kind of meat grinder, Soviet General Vasily Chukov, who was commanding the 62nd Army, implemented a completely brilliant, though frankly terrifying tactic. He called it hugging the enemy. Because the Germans had this massive superiority in the air and in heavy artillery, Chukov ordered his Soviet troops to keep their front lines incredibly close to the German lines. We're talking within just a few yards, or literally just across the street from one another. By hugging the enemy like that, Chukov effectively ensured that the German artillery and aircraft couldn't actually strike the Soviet defenders without blowing up their own men in the process.
Section 3. The Snare. Operation Uranus. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing how this grand trap actually played out. While the 62nd Army was busy bleeding the Germans white inside the rubble of the city, Soviet Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky were meticulously preparing a massive counterstrike out on the snowy steppes. When this trap finally snapped shut in November 1942, it was a display of absolute strategic brilliance. Notice how the thick, red animated noodles of the Soviet pincer movement completely bypassed the hardened core of the German Sixth Army fighting inside the city itself. Instead, they strike far to the north and south, specifically targeting the much weaker, under-equipped Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions that had been left guarding the vulnerable German flanks.
The impact was literally overwhelming. Launched on November 19th, it took a mere 4 days for the sweeping Soviet double encirclement to link up at a town called Kalach. The jaws of the trap had violently locked shut. In less than a week, over 250,000 Axis troops were suddenly cut off from the rest of their forces, totally sealed inside a massive pocket of territory the Germans called the Kessel, or the Cauldron.
Section 4. The aftermath. The pocket collapses.
As we move chronologically into those freezing, totally unforgiving winter months of December 1942 through February 1943, the doom of the Sixth Army was ultimately sealed by a series of fatal, compounding failures. First off, Adolf Hitler issued a strict no-retreat order. He flatly refused permission for General Paulus to even attempt a breakout while his men still had the strength to do it. Why? Well, Hitler was assured by Hermann Goering that the Luftwaffe could simply supply the trapped army from the air. Goering promised 300 tons of supplies daily. But that airlift failed catastrophically, ultimately delivering less than 20% of the food and ammunition those men actually needed to survive. And finally, a desperate outside relief strike led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, dubbed Operation Winterstorm, was entirely repelled by the waiting Soviet forces.
At this point, the end was just inevitable. Starving, freezing to death in the sub-zero Russian winter, and completely out of ammunition, the once mighty Sixth Army simply collapsed. On February 2, 1943, General Friedrich Paulus officially surrendered, and in doing so, he became the very first German field marshal in all of history to be captured alive.
Section 5. By the numbers, the scale of destruction.
To truly wrap our heads around the historical magnitude of all this destruction, we have to look at the hard data. And as we do, I want you to try and imagine these staggering macro statistics represented by literal mountains of crushed noodles. 162. That is the agonizing duration, in days, of the Battle of Stalingrad. From the very first bombs dropping in August to that final surrender in February, it amounts to 5 months, 1 week, and 3 days of unceasing industrialized combat.
And this brilliantly illustrates the staggering scale of loss on both sides, which is honestly almost beyond human comprehension. Over on the Axis side, we're looking at approximately 850,000 men killed, wounded, missing, or captured. But on the Soviet side, the toll is somehow even more staggering. Roughly 1.1 million military casualties, alongside tens of thousands of civilians, at the very least 40,000, who were caught up in that initial crossfire and those early bombing raids. It wasn't just human lives either. The loss of military hardware was a complete catastrophe for the German war effort. The entire Axis arsenal in this sector was just wiped off the map. We're talking about the loss of over 900 aircraft, 1,500 tanks, and 6,000 artillery pieces. It was a massive material bleeding that Nazi Germany simply did not have the industrial capacity to replace.
But out of all this data, perhaps the most sobering statistic of all is this grim reality right here. When the battle finally ended, 91,000 German soldiers marched off into captivity in Soviet POW camps. Out of that massive wave of human beings who were already suffering from starvation, disease, and brutal conditions, barely 5,000 survived to ever see their homes again after the war.
Section 6. The legacy. The ultimate turning point.
The legacy of Stalingrad permanently shifted the entire global momentum of the Second World War. It utterly, completely shattered the long-standing myth of German military invincibility. From this exact moment forward, the Axis forces lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front forever. They were forced into a permanent, grinding, bloody retreat by a Soviet war machine that was now fully capable of outproducing and outmobilizing them. So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this provocative thought to contemplate while you take in this final piece of pasta art. With their elite Sixth Army completely destroyed, their material reserves shattered beyond repair, and the strategic initiative permanently lost on the frozen banks of the Volga, how on earth would the Axis powers attempt to survive a war they could no longer win? Thank you so much for exploring the depths of history with me in this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.